This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Last month, I built this cool little stone ruined building, and it was a lot of fun. I love it. I want to do more. So this week, my goal is to build a modular second floor for this building that's removable, so that this piece of terrain can be used either as a ruined or intact building for a variety of various tabletop wargames and RPGs. And to start, we're going to need more foam core. So I went out and scavenged some fresh sheets of foam core, made some measurements on these sheets, and then cut out some walls for the first floor of the building. As a reminder, all of the floors of this building are going to be exactly 3 inches tall, and it was super easy to do this. I just cut out a bunch of long strips, slightly longer than I needed them to be, that were all about 3 inches in height. I then peeled the paper backing off of one of the sides of each of the pieces of foam core. Because we're only going to be seeing one side of these, we can go ahead and leave the paper on the opposite side if we want to. And once this was done, I tried to trim down these pieces so they would fit inside the existing structure. Because of the way I built the initial walls, I found that these new walls naturally wanted to lean outwards a little bit, and honestly, this is fine with me. I was kind of hoping for this effect, honestly. All I had to do was taper these right-angled walls slightly to give them a little bit of a tilt on those curved edges. Like in part 1 of this build, I once again cut some 3-inch tall pillars out of balsa wood sticks for the corners of the walls, and then I glued our walls to the balsa wood corners using hot glue, non-papered side facing outwards so that we can texture the walls a bit later if we want to. This required a lot of trial and error to fit these walls together, but at the same time, it was really satisfying to see my idea coming together. As remember, we are not gluing these walls down to the foundation, we're gluing them only to each other so that this whole thing can be modular and removable. As you can see here, I'm not worrying about adding doors at this stage. We'll add those in later at a decorating stage. For this inner middle wall, I didn't need to have it go all the way across, but I felt it was helpful as a structural piece if it did, so I just added a wall that went all the way across. I did need to carve down one of the existing walls slightly so this would fit, as well as cutting a bevel in the middle of a new wall so that it would fit even better, but eventually I did get it to fit and the whole structure slid in and out rather nicely. And with the structure of the first floor complete, it was time to lay down the floorboards for the second floor. And there are a number of ways I could have approached this. It might have made sense to cut out another piece of foam core for the second floor and put floorboards on top of that, but I thought it would be more fun to just lay down some balsa wood support beams and then cover those up with stir stick floorboards. Once I found a good position for these support beams, I hot glued them down into place. I think this works really well structurally, but it also aesthetically looks pretty cool. And I then covered these beams in coffee stir stick floorboards using the very same method as I used for the first floor of the building. Except in this case, I used a much smaller amount of PVA glue rather than a whole lot of Mod Podge. And I have to say this worked much better. I also used occasional dabs of hot glue where I felt the structure could use a little bit more support. And at this point you might be realizing, yes, I am building this so that all of the interior floors are not only modular, but have fully playable interiors. I figured if I'm putting this much work into a single piece of terrain, we might as well have the insides be playable as well as the outsides. Once I laid down all the floorboards, I used some balsa wood sticks to build the perimeter of the room, sort of framing it a little bit. And as I was doing this, I left a slight overhang versus the first floor to give the building a little bit of visual interest, but also that's just how these buildings tend to look in real life, I think. I do want to add stairs in here at some point, but I'm not quite sure where I want to put them yet. So I'm going to leave the whole floor area open for now, and we can always excavate a hole for some stairs later. And after trimming down all the excess floorboards and the balsa wood sticks, we are left with something that looks like this. I decided to leave some of the balsa wood support beams a bit long and untrimmed for the aesthetic, but we can always trim them down a little bit more later if we want to. And with the floor and second floor complete, it was time to build the walls for the second floor, and honestly, I just repeated the process from the first floor. I once again cut out strips of 3-inch tall foam core, removed the paper, trim them down to size, cut the corners on a slight angle to give that exaggerated diagonal look, added balsa wood sticks for the corner pieces, and glued everything together with hot glue, making sure to glue it to itself, not to the floor, so that the walls are removable from the floor, and that's it. Second floor completes. I once again repeated the same flooring process on top of this, as I wanted the third floor / attic area to be playable as well. And with all of this tedious flooring complete, it was time to design and construct the roof for the building. After some quick measurements, I cut out a triangle piece for the front wall and then traced this to create an identical back wall. We're going to need a slightly lower side wall, so I traced the same triangle but made it a bit lower at its peak and cut that out as well. These looked good, but I realized I wanted them to sit outside of the perimeter of balsa wood sticks so that there would be a bit of an overhang to the roof. So in order to do this, I needed to add some extra balsa wood struts to both the front and back of the building for our roof frame thing to rest on top of. But of course, before we do this, I realized I needed to figure out where the windows would be so that the struts could line up nicely with the window trim. So I took some time to measure out where the windows should go. I did use a ruler for this, but I also eyeballed it a little bit. Mostly I just tried to make them look roughly symmetrical to one another. And once I had the measurements correct, I used hot glue to glue these stir sticks on, marking the trim of the windows. We will add in the extra windows later, but for now, just knowing where the trim will be is enough to move forward. Once this was done, I used another stir stick to make a template so that for any future windows, I would know how wide they should be and how far away from each other they will be so that they all line up and look consistent. And using our window template, I applied the same treatment to the back of the building, adding more stir stick struts where the windows on the back upper floor will be. But do you know who else has some excellent templates that they've made that you can use? That's right, it's this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website and hosting platform that I have been using for just over a decade now for all of my website needs. And it's honestly super easy to use. You just pick from one of their fabulously designed pre-made templates, or build your own template from scratch using their extremely intuitive new feature, Squarespace Blueprints. No coding or technical knowledge required. I've been using my current Squarespace website to host a gallery of my painted miniatures, all of my painting reference documents, as well as an online store, which has been extremely easy to set up, easy to maintain, and accepts a variety of online payment options. The best part is, you can go to squarespace.com today for a free trial. Check out all the fun features, make a website, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/DanaHowell for 10% off your very first purchase of a website or domain. And with our struts and window trim in place, I was finally able to add the balsa wood support beams that I wanted to support the third floor walls. As you can see, I wanted them to line up with the window trim. I think this looks rather nice, and it definitely is enough to support those upper walls. And with this complete, I realized I wanted the roof to look a little bit more lived in, sagging down a bit on the sides. So I cut a slight curve into each of the upper wall segments that the roof will attach to. I was deliberately a little bit uneven with this, not using any measuring tools to help it look a little bit more organic. And with this complete, I started building the scaffolding for the roof, building a frame out of balsa wood strips that would be both removable and sits just outside the perimeter of the third floor on our balsa wood support beams. I glued our front and back walls to this using hot glue, and then glued a single balsa wood support beam all the way across the two walls, both for stability, but also to show us where the peak of our house will be. After finishing up the frame, I glued on the side wall, and at this point, you can start to see what the structure of the roof we are going for is going to be. We basically have two roof sections perpendicular to one another, and to form the scaffolding for this, I once again used balsa wood strips, cutting notches out of the roof walls for the scaffolding to nest inside of. And once this was looking good, I cemented the bond with hot glue. The first support beam that I laid down was to support the roof beam for our side roof, and I actually carved a tiny notch into this as well to help it fit there a little bit better. Once this was done, I continued adding scaffolding beams, using the first one to determine the sort of natural position for the rest of the beams, and I then used the same method for attaching them as the first beam, cutting out notches for the beams to rest on, and then cementing that bond with hot glue. Once these main support beams were laid down, I started fleshing out the roof using stir sticks. I added a diagonal piece to show where the two roofs would attach to one another, and then started adding individual slats of stir sticks to give the roof shingles a piece to attach to. Is there a simpler way to do this? Yes, probably. But I think there's something really satisfying about building up a house from basic scaffolding and lumber, just like you would with a real house. For the shingles themselves, I explored a few different options. I first tried some simple squares cut out of cereal cardboard, but I found they were both a little bit too plain looking for my liking, as well as being a little bit too hard on my hands to cut out one at a time with scissors. So I ended up going with a slightly less rigid, easier to cut, and more interestingly textured kind of cardboard. Yes, it's just basic corrugated cardboard from shipping boxes, something probably everyone has around the house. And the method for this is I just ripped off all the exterior paper from the corrugated cardboard to expose the ribbing on one side. I then cut this down into long strips with my X-Acto knife, and after this I cut each strip into individual shingles using my scissors. These were a lot quicker to cut out than you might imagine they would be, and the cool thing about these is that they have some built-in interesting texture. It's still a very tedious process to glue down each roof tile individually, but it feels way more worth it to me because I really like the results. For each layer, I laid down 2 lines of tacky glue, attached the shingles, and then using a wet brush dipped in just plain water, I blended out any excess glue over the roof tiles, making it look a bit neater but also more rigid, as what we're doing here is basically paper mache. I continued doing this one row at a time, keeping things pretty irregular, having holes in the roof in some places like an older building would have. And partway through this process, I realized I wanted the roof beams to be a little bit curved, a little bit sunken down with age. And at the same time, I realized there was a really easy way to do this. I just glued on some stir sticks to the roof with hot glue and held the roof beam down slightly while the hot glue dried in place against the beams. I did this to both roofs, gluing a second strip to each side for stability, and with this complete, I kept adding on stir sticks for structure, and then added more and more rows of shingles one by one. I spent several days on this, adding little bits of shingles in my spare time, and I found that it slowly started to take shape the more and more shingles that I added to it. Things were starting to look pretty good, I think, but before I added shingles to the right-hand side of the house, I wanted to add a chimney, and I think I should probably do that before adding shingles. So I took a break from laying down roof tiles and tried to figure out a chimney. And sure, we could do this the simple way and just have a chimney sticking up out of the roof, but if you've been watching this whole thing at this point, you know I don't really like to do things in the simplest way. So I decided to have a chimney that would be visible all the way up the house, starting at the ground floor. To start out, I cut out a scrap piece of foam core about the right size for a chimney and glued it to the wall of the first floor. I then used individual foam bricks left over from the first part of this build. Once again, check out that first video if you haven't already for how to make these bricks. And I then glued these bricks down to the wall and the base of the house to form a sort of chimney-looking exterior. I took special care at each stage of this process to make sure I wasn't gluing the first floor wall to the foundation of the house, as remember, I want this whole thing to be modular, and also learning from my past mistakes, I made sure to leave lots of extra room between each brick for our spackling to go between. I found that the spackling looked much better on our brickwork when there was more room between the bricks. I continued this upwards onto the second floor, adding just a single layer of bricks on the second floor, and finally for the chimney on the top floor, I cut out 2 pieces of foam core about the size and shape I wanted the chimney to be, glued them together with hot glue, and then glued this whole assembly to the top floor roof scaffolding. I built up the wooden scaffolding around this and started to apply some bricks to the chimney when I started to find that I really needed more of a foundation on the sides of the chimney to attach the bricks to. So using some of the foam offcuts from the triangles we made before as a base, I cut out 2 side pieces for the chimney, glued these on, and cut out a back piece as well to create a sort of long empty box, a chimney, if you will. After this, I spent many more hours adding bricks to the chimney and shingles to the roof, and while I would like to continue this process and continue adding decorations to the exterior of the house, maybe some staircases to the interior of the house, and of course I also need to paint this whole thing, we are unfortunately at our terrain building time limit for this month, so you're going to have to tune back in next month for the continuation of this series. But before we go, I would like to extend a special thank you to all of our generous patrons who support this channel and really make this whole endeavor viable as a full-time job for me. So as always, I want to thank each and every one of you very much. I appreciate you all so much, and this week I would especially like to thank Baconivore, Razor Fox Time, and Isabel. If you'd like to see your name up here, gain access to ad-free videos, our exclusive Discord server, or if you'd like to just support the channel, you can do so over at patreon.com/DanaHowell. And with that, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.